sky was thin and brittle at that altitude, a pale field of cold light stretching above the clouds. Through the canopy of a German fighter, a lone pilot watched the silhouettes below him climb with painful slowness. Their wings looked too small, their fuselages too thick, their movements too heavy for the brutal arena they were entering. From his oxygen mask came the faint trace of laughter, a quiet disbelief that anything shaped like that could survive the world waiting above France. But war has a way of rewriting its own rules. What those pilots saw that morning were not mere machines struggling toward the fight. They were looking at the first steps of a weapon built on a different vision of air power, a machine that would turn ridicule into fear and tilt the balance of the skies. The gap between what the eye could see and what history would remember was wide enough to swallow an Air Force whole. And somewhere in that thin, icy air hung the question that would define the months ahead. What happens when a fighter that should not have worked becomes the one no enemy can escape? The story truly begins long before those first encounters above France. In the summer of 1940, while Europe burned under the rapid advance of German air power, American planners studied the wreckage of countries that had fallen and understood a truth that was as cold as the steel they would soon forge. If the next war was to be won, it would be won at altitude. German fighters had carved through the skies with deadly precision, and the United States needed something that could reach higher, hit harder, and endure the kind of punishment that broke lesser machines apart. When engineers at Republic Aviation received the Army's urgent specifications, they faced a dilemma that bordered on the impossible. Traditional fighter design favored light frames, nimble wings, and quick movements. But the threat now rising above Europe demanded a fighter built around a different philosophy. Alexander Kartveli, the Georgian-born designer entrusted with the task, made a choice that startled even his own team. He would not build a sleeker Spitfire or a cleaner Messerschmitt. He would build something larger, stronger, and far more powerful than anything in American service. The prototype that emerged, the P-47B, did not slip into the air so much as force its way upward. Its massive turbocharged engine filled the fuselage like a beating heart of metal and fire. Its wings carried the weight of 8 heavy machine guns. Its silhouette looked awkward, its proportions alarming. Test pilots approached it with the same uneasy respect that soldiers give to unfamiliar artillery. And yet, when the throttle opened, the aircraft climbed as though it had found a secret path through the sky. But progress came at a terrible cost. Between late 1942 and early 1943, training squadrons struggled to tame the machine. The aircraft ground-looped without warning, torque rolled if handled carelessly, and dove so fiercely that pilots occasionally felt the controls freeze beneath their hands. The statistics were grim. Dozens of aircraft lost. Too many young airmen killed before they ever saw an enemy. The Thunderbolt seemed less like a promise and more like a threat that turned inward. Even so, the design refused to be judged by first impressions. Those who survived the early months learned that beneath its size lay an engine that refused to quit and a frame that could drink punishment without falling apart. When combat finally came to the heavy fighter in the spring of 1943, the battlefield introduced yet another challenge. The Thunderbolt could not turn with German fighters. It could not climb with them at lower altitudes. And in those opening weeks, losses mounted while victories remained painfully rare. To the Luftwaffe, this merely confirmed what they already believed. The Americans had brought a mistaken idea into the skies of Europe. A machine too big, too heavy, too slow. A fighter that did not deserve the name. What they missed in those first chaotic months was the subtle shift already taking shape. The P-47 was surviving hits that would have torn their own aircraft apart. And it was carrying a weapon system whose full consequence had not yet been felt. The storm had not arrived, but its first shadow had already crossed the horizon. The turning point arrived not with the victory, but with the survival that should have been impossible. On a June morning in 1943, as a formation of P-47s crossed the coast of France, the Germans struck with the efficiency of hunters who knew their prey. 16 WW190s descended from the sun, their cannon shells walking across the sky. In seconds, a young American pilot named Robert S. Johnson found himself inside a cockpit shredded by fire, his canopy shattered, his instruments failing, and his own blood pooling beneath him. By every rule of air combat, His flight should have ended there. Instead, the Thunderbolt held together, vibrating, burning, refusing to surrender. When a lone FDU, one tiny dub behind him, and emptied its entire arsenal into the wounded aircraft, the German pilot expected nothing more than drifting wreckage. What he saw instead was a machine that absorbed every shell, every burst, and still clawed forward toward the Channel. When Johnson finally landed in England, crews stopped counting the holes after reaching 200. In that wreckage lay the first undeniable proof of what the aircraft truly was. While the Germans laughed at its size, the Americans began discovering its logic. The Thunderbolt did not win by matching the turn radius of the Fu-190 or the climb of the Bf-109. It won by imposing a new geometry on aerial combat. High above 25,000 feet, where German engines gasped for air, the P-47 remained powerful and steady. In a dive, nothing in the European sky could follow it. That weight, mocked only weeks earlier, became a weapon when converted into speed. It was during these months that commanders like Hubert Zemke and Walker Bud Mahurin reshaped the way American pilots fought. Rather than duel in tight circles, they climbed to the edge of the stratosphere, waited, and struck with the violence of falling steel. They called it boom and zoom. German pilots had another name for it, the moment the sky collapsed. At the bottom of those dives, 8 heavy machine guns spoke at once, their streams of fire converging into a 6-foot sphere of destruction. Anything entering that sphere did not simply fall. It came apart. The mission over Schweinfurt and Regensburg revealed this truth with brutal clarity. When a flight of P-47s intercepted Bf-1Ns poised to attack American bombers, the German formation disintegrated in seconds. Witnesses described wings tearing away, fuselages shredding into metal fragments, aircraft vanishing as though erased from the air. It was not grace. It was not elegance. It was industrial firepower distilled into a fighter-sized frame. By late summer, reports inside the Luftwaffe began shifting in tone. Pilots returning from combat described Thunderbolts diving faster than they believed, physics allowed, climbing with new confidence, and delivering fire so dense that survival depended more on luck than skill. The enemy had not changed their aircraft, they had changed the way they used it. And slowly, the balance of the European sky began to tilt. The machine once dismissed as a flying milk bottle was becoming something else entirely. Not a predator defined by agility, but a force defined by inevitability. The kind of weapon that did not need to win the first fight to dominate the war that followed. The real shift in the air war became unmistakable in the autumn of 1943 when altitude itself turned from a German advantage into a German weakness. At 28,000 feet and above, the once dominant Fu-190s and Bf-29s began to lose their breath. Their engines, superb at medium altitude, struggled in the thinning air. Controls felt heavy. Climb rate faded. The horizon narrowed into a place where seconds mattered. It was in this unforgiving layer of sky that Hans Philipp, one of Germany's most decorated aces, met the Thunderbolt on its own terms. His record was extraordinary, more than 200 victories across the eastern and western fronts, a pilot whose instincts had been sharpened by years of survival, but experience could not compensate for physics. When the P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group dropped into the fight from above, they arrived with a momentum Philipp could neither match nor escape. A burst of 50 caliber fire traced across his aircraft, and in an instant the Fu-190 disintegrated into flame and fragments. For the Luftwaffe, it was not just a loss of a pilot. It was the loss of certainty. Headquarters demanded answers. Investigations followed. The reports climbing their way to Goering's desk were stark. The American fighter surpassed German types at altitude, possessed structural integrity beyond expectation, and delivered firepower that outmatched cannon-equipped interceptors in sustained combat. The message beneath the technical jargon was simple. The Luftwaffe no longer controlled the sky. Then came an even more troubling development. The Thunderbolt evolved. With the introduction of the paddle blade propeller on the P-470 variants, climb rate surged. Acceleration improved. The machine that had once lumbered through the lower atmosphere now punched upward with surprising strength. German pilots accustomed to bouncing the Americans from above found themselves confronted by a fighter that could close the vertical gap. Engagements once dictated by the Luftwaffe now belonged to whoever held the most altitude and nerve, and increasingly, that was the Thunderbolt. By the time Allied planners began shaping the invasion of France, the P-47 had grown into a new role, one that would carve its reputation into the memory of every soldier who fought beneath it. The same guns that tore apart fighters now shredded convoys, rail lines, tank columns, and supply routes. When the first waves landed at Normandy on June 6, 1944, more than 500 Thunderbolts patrolled the beaches. German aircraft that attempted to break through found the sky stacked with American fighters from sea level to the edge of the stratosphere. Survivors from the Luftwaffe remembered the experience with a kind of quiet horror. A single pass from a P-47 could erase a column of vehicles. The sound of its diving engine became a warning no one could outrun. Troops spoke of the earth erupting beneath them, of trucks turning into fireballs, of the sudden, brutal silence after a burst of 50 caliber rounds tore the world apart. And beneath these battlefield moments lay a deeper truth. The Luftwaffe was no longer fighting for air superiority. It was fighting for survival. Every day the Thunderbolt remained in the sky, that survival slipped further from reach. What separated the United States from its enemy was not simply the design of a single fighter, but the philosophy that produced it. American planners did not view air power as a contest of dueling aces. They saw it as an industrial campaign, a struggle where logistics, training, and production mattered as much as tactics. The Thunderbolt, with its heavy frame and relentless firepower, was the natural expression of that worldview. Factories in New York and Indiana delivered aircraft at a pace that astonished even Allied commanders. What the Luftwaffe destroyed in a morning raid could be replaced by the following day. Skilled mechanics kept squadrons flying with an abundance of spare parts. Pilots trained with ammunition and fuel in quantities German units could only imagine. When an American fighter group arrived in theater, its airmen carried hundreds of hours of training, disciplined formation practice, and a deep familiarity with their aircraft. German trainees, by 1944, often entered combat with fewer than 100 hours of total flight time. As P-47 units shifted into their expanded roles, the broader world began to grasp the implications. Allies understood that American air power no longer relied on individual brilliance, but on a system capable of sustained pressure. Intercepting bombers, guarding the beaches of Normandy, hunting armored columns, or escorting formations deep into Germany became parts of a single, unified strategy. Air superiority was not the goal. It was the foundation upon which every other operation rested. For the Luftwaffe, this transformation was devastating. The more Germany struggled, the more the American system intensified. Operation Bodenplatte, the desperate New Year's Day offensive of 1945, illustrated the imbalance with painful clarity. German fighters destroyed dozens of American aircraft on the ground, but their victory evaporated within hours as replacement. Thunderbolts rolled off transports and onto fresh hardstands. The Luftwaffe, already crippled by fuel shortages and the loss of veteran pilots, had no such reserve. Each fallen aviator represented experience that could never be replaced. By the end of the war, German commanders themselves spoke openly of the strategic lessons. They admitted that courage and tactical skill could not overcome a nation capable of creating overwhelming strength in the air, mission after mission, month after month. The world, watching from the ruins of Europe and the Pacific, understood the message clearly. Modern warfare belonged not to the aircraft that dazzled in a turning fight, but to the machine backed by a system powerful enough to sustain it. In the final months of the war, when the skies above Europe grew quiet and the smoke began to thin, the Thunderbolt stood as more than a machine of metal and fire. It had become a symbol of a different kind of strength, the kind built not from elegance or agility, but from endurance, discipline, and the vast industrial will of a nation determined to shape the course of history. The aircraft that once drew laughter now carried the weight of countless missions, countless lives saved, and countless stories that would echo long after the guns fell silent. For the pilots who flew it, the P-47 was never merely a fighter. It was a companion in the most unforgiving hours of their lives, a shield forged from American industry, and a reminder that survival often depended on the margin between what a machine could endure and what a human heart could carry. Many returned home with memories of the thunderous dive, the trembling airframe, and the steady rhythm of those 8.50 caliber guns. Others did not return at all, but their legacy remains woven into the steel of every surviving Thunderbolt and the stories told around it. For their adversaries, the memory was different. German pilots who once mocked the bulky silhouette later spoke of the dread that settled in their stomachs when they heard its unmistakable roar. On the ground, soldiers remembered the shadow passing over a road or a field, followed by a storm of fire that changed the course of a battle before anyone could react. The transformation from ridicule to fear was not gradual. It was absolute. It was absolute. Today, when visitors walk through museums and stand before the restored aircraft, they see a war machine at rest. Its paint polished, its story condensed to placards and quiet displays. But the truth runs deeper. The P-47 tells the story of a nation discovering that its greatest power lay not only in invention, but in the ability to build, supply, train, and sustain on a scale the world had never seen. It is a reminder that wars are won not only by moments of heroism, but by systems that rise to meet the demands of history. And perhaps that is the lasting lesson of the Thunderbolt, that strength, when paired with purpose, becomes something greater than the sum of its parts. As you reflect on its journey, consider what this story reveals about resilience, sacrifice, and the choices that shape the modern world. If you found meaning in this story, share your thoughts. What part of the Thunderbolt's legacy speaks to you most deeply? And what lesson from this era do you believe still matters today?